So before we get down and dirty into today's tech review of the 2018 Mercedes AMG S63 sedan, some behind the scenes. Before this turned up on my doorstep, I spent 10 days with a luxury crossover. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a luxury crossover. That's kind of like saying the driving dynamics equivalent of mind-numbing. So I needed to schedule something that was the antithesis of a baby buggy. I mean, for lack of a better term, it's a fancy baby buggy. Even the Lexus, which it was. So I decided, now there are many other ways we could have done this, but I decided let's do something with 603 horsepower. Let me say that again, 603 horsepower from a completely different country, hell, a different continent than that Lexus, 664 pounds of torque. Now, we've driven this engine in two other Mercedes, but we've also driven this engine in not a Mercedes. So now how does it work here? We need to focus on. And we'll do that in the coming full first drive review, but there is so many changes to the S63 derivation of the 2018 Mercedes S Class mid-cycle refresh that in this tech review, all we're gonna do is focus on this one, and we'll do a separate tech review and a separate first drive review of the other derivation of 2018 S Classes later on down in season 9. So with that, let's dive into a tech review of this stunning Celente Gray Santa Maria Madre di Dios Mercedes AMG S63. Now, I would argue the most important part of any car that bears the badge Elfrecht, Melcha und Grossasbach is the heart, which is hand-built in a Vaterbach. So to really illustrate how important it is in this S63, I am coming to you from the future of Season 9 with a lowly S560 to understand the difference. Now, this has a 4-liter twin-turbo V8. Sounds very familiar when you look at the specs of an S63. But this, it makes do with a measly 463 horsepower and 516 pounds of torque. Now, how could you do that with such a large car? Well, apparently, the folks in Vaterbach decided to change a couple of things from the same engine. So it's still a 4-liter twin-turbo V8. The turbochargers are in the V in both cases. But in this case, the numbers, I tell you this in previous episodes, that things are comical. This is beyond comical. It's 603 horsepower, which comes in at 5,500 RPM, stays flat all the way to 6,000 RPM. Then there's the torque. 664 pounds of torque from a 4-liter, smaller V8 than what was in the previous car, comes in at 2,750 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 4,500 RPM. Now that much power is routed to all 4 wheels in the S63. We will talk about that in the full first drive review, so make sure you come back for that. And that is the 9-speed automatic that is somewhat between the drive wheels and the engine. Now we've seen this transmission in many other Mercedes. It is changed for this in that it is more tuned for an AMG application. You know what, just let those numbers roll through your brain because 664 pounds of torque that comes out of a 4-liter V8. Oh, by the way, the 2 Aston Martins that we've seen with the same engine, that doesn't get 664 pounds of torque. Now on the inside, thankfully, not much has changed, which is to say a very good thing, because I would argue back in 2013 when they changed this interior, what I told you was it looks as if the exact idea, forget about the design, the idea that first popped into the interior designer's brain literally skipped design, ideation, clay, mock-ups, and overall approval and made it directly into production. That's how good this is. Now, I would argue the black really doesn't do it justice because you can customize all this. Like, for example, the top of the dash and the door panel can be a different color, even down to the detail of this here. This piping can be a different color to contrast, even like the stitching contrasts here, and really show what can be done on the interior. It's almost a crime to buy one of these things off the rack. You really want to spend some time in customizing it, especially when you have the pageantry of the vents and the Burmester grills. And this, again, it went from UX to art in 2013. Now they've kind of stepped it up here where they've changed the steering wheel, and if I'm honest, the steering wheel in the 2013 S Class, it looked like they took it literally from a Ford LTD, which, no joke, it just didn't look good. This, it now finally matches the pageantry of the overall interior. Then they pilfered some of the UX from the E-Class, like the different sport gauges and some of the UX, and obviously now it has Apple CarPlay. And I would argue this is like an open letter to the folks in Stuttgart. You know what, technology is not always the answer. I get it, you can do more, there's more stuff that can be done with the computers, but like the Porsche and the BMW and the Aston Martin, they still have the bezels, or in some cases they still have the old world gauges with, like in the case of the Porsche, it's got the TFT screens on each side with a real tachometer in the center. You know what, taking a step back might actually take many steps forward in a car like this. Oh, and there's one more thing. This one is fitted with a very fancy back seat, which we will cover in the full first drive review. And now back to the future to discuss driving dynamics, specifically the platform that is the S560, which serves as building blocks, for lack of a better term, for all S-Class, including the S63. And the most basic of those building blocks is the suspension. In the front, it's a multi-link unit. In the rear, surprise of all surprises, also a multi-link unit. Now that's comprised of a couple of different pieces of hardware. At each corner, single tube shock absorbers. Both front and rear there's a torsion bar. Then there's the adjustable air ride system. Now this all works in conjunction with each other, especially in the S63, because it's tuned specifically for that AMG application over this S560. Then there's that all-wheel drive system, and you know how, like in a Porsche, a BMW, or Mercedes, they bring over a really cool car like, I don't know, a Porsche Targa 911, and they only put it on offer as all-wheel drive, and we're like, no, please, why can't we have a two-wheel drive? We don't want any of the torque going to the front. Well, apparently they're sort of listening, because in the tuned all-wheel drive system that's in the S63, up to 100% of the torque can go to the rear wheels. Now I searched high and low in my entire time with that car, couldn't find a switch to turn off the front wheels. It basically works through the computer under load, so we'll have to spend some time talking about that in the full first drive review. Then there are the wheels, 19 inches fitted as standard all the way around. Then there are the brakes, 15.4-inch diameter in the front with 6 piston calipers, 14.2 in the rear with 1 piston caliper. Now there is the option for carbon ceramic rotors. In the front it goes to 16.5 inches, still 6 piston caliper, 14.2 is the same in the rear, also with a 1 piston caliper. Then there's the adjustable exhaust, so you can change the note depending on which setup you're in, whether it's Sport Plus or something like that. Well, a little hint advice here. If you saw our GT3 episode, you know that we're capturing the natural sound a bit differently now, and it's far more effective. Well, let's just say in the S63 episode, it's even more effective than that. So why don't you bring some earplugs? And don't say I didn't warn you. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if you guys have caught on by now that I tend to favor saving the more shocking numbers for the end of these tech reviews. And in this case, it's absolutely gotta be the weight. But before I tell you what it is, I need to share that there are some weight-saving measures going on here. All of this is aluminum. The spare tire well, that's made of carbon fiber. So there's a lot of effort. I mean, definitely the college try. But even with that, 4,806 pounds. I don't know about you, but that sounds really close to 5,000 pounds for me. And it shouldn't be surprising, because look at the size here, people. The wheelbase, 124.6, the overall length, 208.5. Now, as a basis of comparison, the BMW's wheelbase is 2 inches longer, and the Porsche Panamera, I would argue, was not as competitive when this car first came out, but now it is absolutely competitive. That is 6 inches shorter wheelbase. Yes, there is a longer wheelbase derivation on offer, but I would argue that doesn't compete directly with this one here. So now that we know all of this information, please come back for the full first drive review of the S63. But in the interim, I want to leave you with a question. And the question has to do with the engine that is in this car. If you remember, we drove it in an Aston Martin DB11, and I was very honest with you and told you that it is the better of the two DB11s. But if it's my money, I'm always going to go for the V12. Why? because Washington and Brussels are trying to take our V12s away from us. So if I have the opportunity with my own checkbook to vote against Washington and Brussels, I'm going to do that. Well, guess what? We have the same vote on offer here. And before we even get to the full first drive review, I'm just going to tell you, in terms of driving dynamics, this is by far the better car than the S65, but the S65, it's got two things going for it. Number one, it's two-wheel drive, and number two, it's got a 12-cylinder engine, so another opportunity to tell Washington and Brussels to go stick it up there you know what. Anyway, I want to know from you, what would you choose? Why would you choose it? But most importantly, what region of the world do you hail from? Because I gotta believe tax schemes have a huge impact on who buys these kinds of cars. So let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all in word, MotoManTV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I do want to leave you with one thing. You guys know that we have our app available for free on Apple iTunes and Google Play. But guess what? We are now also live on the Amazon App Store. So that means you can get the app in all of the Amazon ecosystem of devices, whatever that means. So download to your heart's content in any one of those three places. We would really appreciate that. Until I see you for the full first drive review of the 2018 Mercedes AMG S63 in Celente Gray. By the way, did I say it's Celente Gray? Bis später.